Hello and welcome to the viewers of this video. This is the Orange Fan here, bringing you another entry for the episode Recap and Thoughts category. This video will be dedicated to the B segment of episode 4 of Codename Kids Next Door, Operation Cowgirl. We begin this segment with the Sector V operatives of the Kids Next Door trying to escape from Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb, who are chasing them down the street in one of their super chairs. This one in particular bears a strong resemblance to a giant tank. We also see that number 2 is carrying a small dome in his hands. Suddenly, a lasso pulls the Sector V operatives out of the way of the super chair, and Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb stop in a moment of confusion before they quickly see the individual with the lasso. At this point in time, the individual with the lasso is shown as a shadowy figure, so we don't have a clear look for what this individual looks like, but we can still tell that this individual is dressed like a cowgirl, and she refuses to hand the dome over to Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb. The villain duo respond with, the villainous duo respond by launching a weapon towards the cowgirl and Sector V. This causes the cowgirl to lose her grip on the lasso, and the Sector V operatives lose their grip on the dome. Although we see the Sector V operatives falling towards the street, we quickly jump to a different scene which shows the Sector V operatives are safe and sound. They're just asleep right now. The Sector V operatives wake up and they find themselves not at their own treehouse, but a different treehouse. This treehouse resembles a ranch, and the giant tree is growing in the middle of a mall. After taking a quick look at this ranch-themed treehouse, the Sector V operatives, and we, the audience by extension, finally get a clear look at the cowgirl. She's revealed to be an adult named Lasso Lass, and she also mentions that she's the last member of the Cowboy Kids Club, a group that you could describe as a Wild West themed version of the Kids Next Door, or a Wild West themed equivalent to the Kids Next Door. Lasso Lass proceeds to give the Sector V operatives a tour of her treehouse and shows them the technology within this treehouse. 4 of the 5 Sector V operatives are impressed by the treehouse and its technology. Number 1, though, is the one Sector V operative who is not impressed, and he's rather dismissive of the treehouse and its technology as being very outdated. After a quick scene showing us Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb in the backyard of their house debating over whether to open the dome or not, we cut back to Lasso Lass's treehouse, where she's continuing to give a tour and demonstrating some of her lasso skills. Number 1 is growing impatient, but he stumbles upon a picture which contains a girl, 2 boys, and a horse. He questions who the individuals in the picture are, and Lasso Lass reveals that those are the members of the Cowboy Kids Club. The girl is her, and the 2 boys are the other members of the Cowboy Kids Club. But then she sadly remembers that they're no longer part of the group after they grew up. And number 1 actually shows sympathy over this sad event. But Lasso Lass quickly cheers up when she says that Sector V can help her to reorganize or to relaunch the Cowboy Kids Club. But number 1 is rather dismissive of the idea, saying that that the Sector V operatives aren't Wild West themed individuals, and saying that adults can't fight adult tyranny. And Lasso Lass insists that she's not an adult, even though number 1 points out that she is an adult at this point in time. Eventually, Lasso Lass says that she can do anything that the Sector V operatives can do, and number one challenges her to to reclaim the dome from Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb, and Lasso Lass accepts the challenge. She calls for her horse, Clip Clop, and then Lasso Lass and Clip Clop head off to Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb's house to reclaim the dome. Number one decides now is the time for them to return to their own treehouse, but the other Sector V operatives insist that they want to stay and see Lasso Lass return. So number one begrudgingly agrees to wait for Lasso Lass's return. After an entire day passes, Lasso Lass still hasn't returned yet, and number one decides that now they're going to head back to their own treehouse. Suddenly, though, Lasso Lass contacts them over the radio, and she tells them that Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb are holding a pizza party and has invited them to come over. But then she quickly admits that it's really a trap and warns them to stay away. But Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb try to talk over her and try to impersonate her, insisting that they should bring pizza and come over. So 4 of the Sector V operatives question number one what they should do now. We then head to the backyard of Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb's house, and we see that Lasso Lass and Clip Clop are tied up, and they're hanging. The rope is hanging on a tree branch, and Lasso Lass and Clip Clop are hanging over a pool of what looks to be a very dangerous substance. And soon enough, number one arrives with a pizza box, but then when he opens the pizza box, it's one of those custom phones where you tie a string between 2 cans. This was one of the technology that Lasso Lass showed the Sector V operatives earlier. And he calls out for the kids next door to take battle stations. We soon see that the rest of the Sector V operatives have they've modified Lasso Lass's treehouse into a giant robotic horse. Number two is Number two is on top of the robot horse with the reins, while number 3, number 4, and number 5 are inside the treehouse robot horse, and number 1 joins number 2 on top of the robot horse. Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb are currently sitting in lounging chairs, but then they reveal that these lounging chairs are actually another one of their super chairs, and they push a button so that the legs of the chair grow in size. So the super chair matches the robot horse in terms of size. So we do see the giant robot horse and the super chair fighting each other, and eventually it ends with the Sector V operatives bringing out a giant lance, and Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb use a giant rake as their lance, and so it essentially turns into a jousting match. But in the end, the robot horse is destroyed and the Sector V operatives are captured, and they're hanging over another pool of this dangerous substance. We do see that it burnt one of the legs of the super chair, although the leg ended up regenerating. So with Lasso Lass, Clip Clop, and the Sector V operatives hanging over the dangerous substance pools, Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb kind of take a moment to gloat, and Mr. Fibb decides now to open the dome, which reveals a wig. And when he puts the wig on, Lasso Lass recognizes Mr. Fibb as one of the members of the Cowboy Kids Club. She calls him Timmy, but he insists on being called Timothy. And apparently, it turns out Mr. Fibb lost his hair as early as the age of 14. And he was upset when that he didn't get to go to the prom with Lasso Lass. She went to the prom with, I believe they said his name was Tommy. I think they said his name was Tommy, if I'm remembering right. And Clip Clop recognizes Mr. Wink as the other member of the Cowboy Kids Club. Mr. Wink confirms this is the case, and he reveals his first name to be John. But Lasso Lass tries to cheer Mr. Fibb up, and she helps him to fix up his wig so that it looks less flimsy or less haphazardly put together. And Mr. Fibb seems to calm down, and he questions if the wig really looks good on him. And Lasso Lass admits that it looks so good that she could kiss him, and she actually does want to kiss Mr. Fibb, but he gets scared and runs off. And Clip Clop seems to want to do something with Mr. Wink, or Clip Clop is giving Mr. Wink a look, and he gets scared and he runs off too. So Lasso Lass and Clip Clop chase after Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb, and the Sector V operatives are still hanging over the pool of the dangerous substance. And the segment ends with 4 of the Sector V operatives saying bye to Lasso Lass with Wild West terminology, while number 1 is growing more and more irritated by it. So this segment is the second time when Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb are the central villains of a segment. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure this is actually the last segment where they are the central villains of the segment. They still go on to appear throughout the rest of the series. They still have, I would argue, fairly major appearances. It's just that usually these appearances are more with them as, they're usually with groups of other villains. Like, they're more like villain group segments that they appear in. Or they might appear as like having somewhat of a bit role compared to another villain, but they still go on to appear throughout the rest of the series. This is just the last one where only they appear as the villains of the segment, or where they are the undisputed central villains of the segment. And we actually did end up getting to learn a lot about Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb. Like, we found out that they were friends with someone named Lasso Lass, and the 3 of them and Clip Clop the horse formed the Cowboy Kids Club, a Wild West equivalent to the Kids Next Door. And actually, some people might argue that this segment shows some early installment weirdness because of the Cowboy Kids Club existence. And the reason why some might argue that is because later seasons and even later episodes of season 1 later episodes of season 1 established the Kids Next Door as being a global organization, not just the Sector V operatives. And later seasons do establish that the Kids Next Door organization has actually been around for a very long time. It's not just the generation of the Sector V operatives. The Sector V operatives generation isn't the only generation of Kids Next Door operatives. The organization had actually been around for quite some time now, and at least a few other entries in the series do kind of delve into the past of the Kids Next Door to some extent. We'll cross those bridges when we get to them. But essentially, I guess you could argue that the Cowboy Kids Club could be seen as early installment weirdness because the Kids Next Door having such a widespread influence throughout the planet would make you think, why not just have Lasso Lass and Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb be former Kids Next Door operatives? But again, this is probably more because it's probably at this point they hadn't really decided on the Kids Next Door organization being a global organization. And they hadn't really came up with I'm guessing they probably hadn't thought of the Kids Next Door organization being around for a long time when they originally wrote this segment. So I guess you could argue that this was early installment weirdness because of that. And it's worth noting that Lasso Lass doesn't appear later on in the series either. Or if she does appear, it might just be like a minor cameo. But otherwise, this is really her only major appearance at the very least, and I'm pretty confident that she doesn't appear again throughout the rest of the series. So I guess you could make that argument about that early installment weirdness. You could also say there was some other early installment weirdness with that kind of highlights how the earlier season 1 episodes kind of portray the Sector V operatives in a less heroic light. Because in this segment, we don't really receive an explanation for why the Sector V operatives took Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb's dome. And yeah, we don't. And we see that there wasn't really anything dangerous about the dome. It was just a wig. Now, to be fair, the Sector V operatives didn't seem to realize that the dome just contained a wig until the big reveal. But otherwise, it does seem kind of unusual that they would take this dome for no other reason. And yeah, so you could argue this is also an example of the Sector V operatives coming off as less heroic earlier on in the series run. So I guess, yeah, that's another example of that early installment weirdness. Otherwise, I guess, yeah, I've seen some viewers say that they could argue that this segment could be considered a number 1 spotlight segment, if only for the fact that number 1 is really the only Sector V operative that has extensive dialogue throughout the segment. And when I rewatched the segment for the recap and thoughts video here, yeah, I did notice number 1 was the Sector V operative who did most of the talking throughout the segment. Like, the other 4 Sector V operatives do have lines, but they're pretty minimal, or sometimes they're just like background dialogue, like where you hear characters talking in the background, but it's not really you don't really get to hear the dialogue too clearly. It just sounds like close to background noise, you could say. That's kind of the case here for this segment. Number 1 was really the one doing most of the talking for his teammates, and number 1, I guess you could say he was the one that kind of went through the most change, I guess, throughout the segment. Like, he was pretty dismissive of the Cowboy Kids Club at first, but he eventually came around to an extent. Like, he was willing to help Lasso Lass and Clip Clop out, but at the end of the segment, he was shown kind of irritated that his teammates wanted to continue the Wild West terminology. So, yeah, I guess I could see that argument about how one could argue this segment was sort of a number 1 spotlight appearance. And otherwise, I think that's it for now. So, yeah, this segment did introduce us to... this segment did kind of give us some more backstory for Mr. Wink and Mr. Fibb, and it is more or less the last segment where they appear as the central villains. So it was cool that they at least gave us a little more insight on their characters, and we did get to meet one of their friends from the past. Although, and again, you could argue that this segment kind of highlights the early installment weirdness of season 1. And, oh, that's right, as another little detail, episode 4 is the first episode where the delightful children from down the lane are absent in all the segments of that particular episode, because they at least had one appearance in one of the segments for episodes 1, 2, and 3. This episode, the delightful children are not present in the A segment or the B segment. So that's a nice little, just a little trivia for anyone who's curious. And otherwise, yeah, I think that's it. So as of this video, we've now discussed the B segment of episode 4 of Codename Kids Next Door on this channel. Take care, and until next time.